The air in the Hamptons tastes different. It's a blend of salt from the Atlantic, the cloying sweetness of $10,000 floral arrangements, and the metallic tang of old money. I stood on a perfectly manicured lawn that sloped down towards a private beach, holding a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking. The bubbles died a slow death, just like the polite smiles on the faces around me. They were all here. The hedge fund managers with their trophy wives, the ancient matriarchs with skins stretched as tight as their trust funds, the young heirs who had never known a day of real work. My suit, a simple dark gray Brooks Brothers I'd owned for 10 years, felt like a coat of armor in a prison all at once. It was clean, it fit well, but on me, it looked like what it was, the uniform of an outsider. My hands, with their thickened knuckles and a network of scars from a lifetime of labor, looked obscene wrapped around the delicate stem of the champagne flute. Then I saw her. My daughter, Amelia. My Amy. She was a vision in white, laughing at something her new husband, Julian Croft, had whispered in her ear. She looked happy. Almost. From 50 yards away, I could still see the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd been practicing that smile for months, ever since Julian had slipped a diamond the size of a pigeon's egg on her finger and welcomed her into his world. A world of summer homes, charity galas, and casual cruelty disguised as wit. Julian was perfect. That was the problem. He had the perfect teeth, the perfect hair that fell with calculated carelessness over his forehead, and the perfect pedigree from some old East Coast family that had supposedly come over on the Mayflower. He moved through the crowd like a shark in a tailored tuxedo, all predatory grace and effortless charm. He saw me watching, and his smile widened. He excused himself from his circle of admirers and began to weave his way towards me. Amy watched him go, a flicker of something, apprehension maybe, in her eyes before she was swallowed up by a group of bridesmaids. "Frank," Julian said, his voice as smooth as the aged scotch they were serving at the bar. He placed a hand on my shoulder. It was meant to look familiar, friendly. It felt like an appraisal, like a butcher judging a side of beef. "Enjoying the party?" "It's a beautiful wedding, Julian," I said. My voice was rougher than his, gravel to his silk. "You've made my daughter very happy." "I intend to keep her that way," he said, his smile never wavering. He gestured with his head toward the secluded stone terrace overlooking the sea. "Walk with me for a moment." It wasn't a request. We walked in silence, the sound of the orchestra fading behind us, replaced by the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. He stopped at the edge of the terrace and turned to face me, his back to the endless ocean. For the first time, the smile was gone. His eyes were cold, flat, and utterly devoid of the charm he wore so easily. "Frank, let's be honest with each other," he began, his tone dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He straightened the cuffs of his shirt, a small, deliberate gesture of power. I waited. I've spent my life in rooms with men like Julian, men who believe their birthright and their bank accounts make them kings. They all have the same tells, the same arrogant tilt of the head, the same belief that everyone else is a piece on their personal chessboard. He looked me up and down, a slow, dismissive scan from my worn leather shoes to my weathered face. "You simply don't belong here," he said. 10 words. They hung in the salty air between us. It wasn't an insult shouted in anger. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a judge passing sentence. He was drawing a line in the sand. On one side was his world, this world of inherited wealth, of whispered connections, of effortless superiority. On the other side was me, the contractor, the simple man who'd built a small business with his bare hands. The relic. I glanced over his shoulder, back towards the glowing marquee where my daughter was dancing. She looked over, saw us talking, and offered a small, hesitant wave. Julian didn't turn. His eyes were locked on mine. He saw my glance, and a flicker of triumph crossed his face. He thought he had her. He thought he had won. "This is our world now," he continued, pressing his advantage. "Amy's and mine. A world you're not part of. For her sake, it's better if you understand that now. Keep your distance. Send a nice check at Christmas. That's the role you play from now on." I didn't say a word. The funny thing about spending 40 years building an empire in the shadows is you learn to control your face. Anger is a luxury. Outrage is a weakness. My heart rate didn't even quicken. Instead, a profound, icy calm washed over me. The kind of calm my crews recognize right before someone is about to learn a very, very expensive lesson. In that moment, I wasn't looking at my daughter's new husband. I was looking at a liability, a threat that had breached my perimeter and was now standing in the heart of my world, holding my most precious asset hostage. He thought he was dismissing a simple, out-of-his-depth father-in-law. He had no idea he was declaring war on a man who had built a private logistics and security company so vast and discreet that it made the fortunes of everyone at this party look like pocket change. A man whose name was a ghost whispered in boardrooms and government back offices from D.C. to Dubai. He mistook my silence for acquiescence. He mistook my stillness for defeat. It was a fatal miscalculation. I gave a single, slow nod. Julian's perfect smile returned. He thought he'd been understood. He clapped me on the shoulder again, a gesture of finality. Good. I'm glad we had the chat, Frank. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a wife to attend to. He turned and walked back towards the light and the music, his posture radiating victory. I watched him go. I watched my daughter greet him with a worried look, which he smoothed away with a kiss. I watched them merge back into the glittering crowd. Then I turned, walked away from the party, and didn't look back. The valets, seeing me leave so early, exchanged knowing glances. The sad, working-class father, driven out by the new money. I got into my truck, a 10-year-old Ford F-150 that was cleaner on the inside than most of their sports cars, and pulled out of the long, tree-lined driveway. Once the gates of the estate were behind me, I pulled over to the side of the quiet country road. The mask of calm indifference dropped. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. He didn't know who I was. He didn't know what I was capable of. He didn't know that with 10 words, he hadn't just insulted me. He had just signed his own death warrant. I picked up my phone. It wasn't a sleek, new smartphone. It was an old, encrypted satellite model that most people would mistake for a brick. I scrolled to a single contact saved under the name Banker. The phone rang once before he picked up. "Marcus," I said, my voice low and steady. "It's me." There was no greeting on the other end of the line. Just a quiet click and the faintest trace of static, a silence that was waiting to be filled. Marcus never wasted time on pleasantries. "It's me," I said, though he already knew. The number I was calling from was a ghost, and it only ever called one other number in the world. "Go ahead, Frank." His voice was calm, neutral. The voice of a man who could discuss a multi-billion-dollar acquisition or a Category 5 hurricane with the same detached precision. To the world, Marcus Thorne was a discreet, high-end wealth manager for a handful of reclusive clients. In reality, he was the chief operating officer of my life's work, the curator of my secrets, the man who turned my intentions into actions. I took a deep breath, the air in the cab of my truck suddenly feeling cold and thin. "Marcus, activate protocol contingent." There was a half-second pause on the line. Not a surprise, but a focus. In 20 years, I had only used that phrase twice before. Once to dismantle a rival corporation that tried to use political leverage to steal a government contract, and once to locate a kidnapped executive in Bogota. It was my own personal declaration of war. It meant unlimited resources, all assets deployed, no questions asked. "Contingent is active," Marcus said. The calm in his voice was now underpinned by a razor's edge. "Name the subject." "Julian Croft," I said, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. "As in Croft Ventures. My son-in-law." I heard the soft, almost imperceptible sound of typing in the background. Marcus was already working. "Understood. The objective?" "Full spectrum analysis," I said, my voice dropping lower. "Financial, personal, digital. I want to know who he owes, who he owns, and who he's sleeping with. I want a complete wireframe of his life, every connection, every vulnerability. I want to know the name of his third-grade teacher and what he ate for breakfast this morning. No detail is too small. Standard asset profile. We can start immediately," Marcus replied. "No," I corrected him. This isn't a profile. This is a demolition plan. Start with the foundation, his venture capital fund. I want a forensic audit. Deep dive. I want to know where every dollar came from and where every dollar went. I have a feeling the entire structure is hollow. Find the cracks, Marcus. More typing. I could picture him in his soundproofed home office in upstate New York, screens glowing around him, a web of information already beginning to coalesce. He wasn't a banker. He was a spy master whose weapon of choice was the decimal point. Timeline for preliminary report, he asked. 48 hours, I said. Actionable intelligence only. I want levers I can pull, not a novel. Understood. You'll have the preliminary by 2200 Sunday. The precision was comforting. It was the language of my world. Clear objectives, firm deadlines. He paused again, a different kind of pause this time. It was the one question he always had to ask when protocol contingent was engaged. Frank, what is the desired end state? I looked through my windshield, back down the long, winding road toward the distant glow of the wedding reception. I could almost hear the faint strains of music, the murmur of laughter. My daughter was in there, dancing with a man who had just tried to cut her off from the only real thing in her life. He thought he was exiling me. He didn't realize he had just locked himself in a cage with me. What was the desired end state? It wasn't just about money. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about a lesson. The kind of lesson that is carved into a man's soul. The end state, Marcus, I said slowly, letting the weight of each word settle, is erasure. I want to take away everything he has, everything he is, and everything he ever hoped to be. I want him to wake up in a month and not recognize his own life. I want him to have nothing left but the memory of the 10 words he said to me tonight. For the first time, I heard something other than neutrality in Marcus's voice. It was a flicker of satisfaction. He knew my story. He knew about my wife, about how I'd raised Amy on my own. He understood. Consider it done, Frank, he said. The line went dead. I put the satellite phone back in the glove compartment, next to a tire gauge and a pair of worn leatherwork gloves. The engine of the F-150 rumbled to life with a turn of the key, a familiar, honest sound in the quiet of the Hamptons night. I pulled back onto the road, heading west, away from the ocean, away from the party, away from the glittering lie my daughter was now living. The rage was gone. The hurt was gone. They had been converted into fuel, channeled into the cold, clean engine of purpose that had driven me my entire life. I wasn't an angry father-in-law anymore. I was a man with a project, and I always finish what I start. The 2-hour drive from the Hamptons back to my corner of Connecticut was a journey between worlds. I left behind the land of manicured perfection and counterfeit smiles and drove toward the only place I'd ever felt truly at peace. The headlights of the F-150 cut a lonely path through the darkness, the steady hum of the engine a familiar mantra. I didn't turn on the radio. I preferred the silence. It gave me room to think. Julian's 10 words echoed in the quiet cab, but they no longer stung. They were simply data points now, slotted into an equation that was rapidly solving itself. He called my world different. He had no idea. His world was a stage, built of inherited assumptions and fragile egos. My world was the foundation beneath that stage. It was the bedrock, the rebar, the high-tensile steel holding everything up. The dirty, unseen, and absolutely essential truth. I'd spent a lifetime being underestimated. It was the cornerstone of my success. I pulled into the gravel driveway of my house just after midnight. It's not a mansion. It's a 2-story colonial I designed and helped build 30 years ago, nestled on 10 acres of dense woodland. The wood siding is a little weathered, the stone chimney solid and reassuring. To any passerby, it's the home of a successful but not ostentatious local businessman. That's exactly what I wanted them to see. Inside, the house was silent and smelled of lemon oil, old books, and the faint, pleasant aroma of the sawdust that always clung to my work boots. Every scuff on the hardwood floor, every chip in the paint on the doorframe was a memory. This was the house where I'd brought Amy home from the hospital. The house where my wife, Sarah, had planted the lilac bushes that still bloomed every spring by the back porch. The house she had died in. I walked through the dark living room and into the kitchen, my hand finding the light switch out of pure muscle memory. I poured myself a glass of water from the tap and stood there, looking out the window into the blackness of the woods. Her picture was on the refrigerator, held up by a silly magnet Amy had made in kindergarten. A picture from our 20th anniversary, a few years before the cancer took her. Her smile was real. It reached her eyes and lit up her whole face. "He's a wolf, Sarah," I whispered into the empty room. I let a wolf into our little girl's life. When she was sick, in those final quiet weeks, we spent a lot of time talking on the back porch. One evening, she took my hand, my big, rough hand, in her two small, fragile ones. "Protect our girl, Frank," she'd said, her voice thin but firm. "The world is full of charming boys with empty hearts. Promise me you'll be your shield." I had promised, and for a while, I thought I had succeeded. I had built a fortress of love and security around Amy, given her everything she needed to be a good, strong, trusting person. But in doing so, I had forgotten to teach her how to spot the predators. I had made her strong, but I hadn't made her suspicious. That was my failing, and Julian was the result. I finished my water, rinsed the glass, and placed it in the dish rack to dry. Then I went down to the basement. The basement wasn't finished like the ones in the Hamptons, with their wine cellars and home theaters. Mine was a workshop. A massive oak workbench ran along one wall, littered with tools that were clean and meticulously organized. The air smelled of grease, metal, and wood. It was my sanctuary. But against the far wall, beneath a dusty canvas tarp, was something that didn't belong with the table saws and drill presses. I pulled off the tarp. It was a dark green, military-issue footlocker, scratched, dented, with faded stenciling on the side that was too worn to read. I knelt and unlatched the two heavy clasps. The lid opened with a low groan. The contents didn't look like much. A stack of old passports, each with my picture but a different name and nationality. A string of dark, polished stones that looked like prayer beads. A faded photograph of a dozen young men, myself included, standing in front of a dusty, unmarked helicopter somewhere that was all sand and rock. We weren't smiling. We were hard-eyed and thin, men who had seen too much. Men who solved problems that couldn't be solved with contracts and lawyers. My hand went to the bottom of the locker and pulled out a small, heavy, canvas-wrapped object. I unwrapped it carefully. It was an old, Soviet-era Makarov pistol. The steel was cold and dense in my palm. I hadn't held it in years. I checked the magazine out of instinct, still full. Beside it lay a single, heavy coin made of a metal I couldn't identify. It was dull, almost black, with a stylized scorpion etched on one side and a single, foreign word on the other. A marker, a favor owed to me by a man in the shadows. A man far more dangerous than anyone Julian Croft had ever met. You don't build what I've built by simply outworking the competition. You don't create a global logistics network that can move anything, anywhere, anytime by following the rules. You build it with leverage, with secrets, with the kind of alliances that are forged in fire and sealed in blood. You build it by being the man who can make one phone call and have a problem on the other side of the world disappear. I had put this part of my life away when Sarah got sick. I wanted to be the man she saw, the simple, honest builder, the loving father, for Amy. But Julian, with his casual cruelty and his 10 little words, had reminded me of a fundamental truth. You can't protect sheep from wolves by being a sheep. You have to be a bigger, quieter, more patient wolf. I took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of gun oil and old memories filling my lungs. I rewrapped the pistol and the coin, placed them back in the footlocker, and closed the heavy lid. The latches clicked shut with a sound of finality. I hadn't needed to take anything out. I just needed to remember. I switched off the workshop light, leaving the footlocker once again in darkness. The part of me it represented was no longer dormant. It was awake, alert, and focused. Back upstairs, I checked my phone. No messages. Marcus was working. The machine was in motion. The hunter was awake. And the hunt had begun. Sunday night at 21:59 exactly, my encrypted phone buzzed once. A single file had arrived. There was no sender, no subject line, just a string of alphanumeric code. I opened it. The document wasn't a report, it was a blueprint. Marcus hadn't just gathered data. He'd organized it into a structural schematic of Julian Croft's entire financial life. And as I'd suspected, the thing was a house of cards built on a swamp. I sat at my solid oak kitchen table, a single lamp casting a pool of light on the tablet screen. The numbers and charts told a story far more damning than any prose. Croft Ventures wasn't a venture capital firm. It was a vanity project, a leaky bucket Julian used to maintain the illusion of wealth. He had exactly 7 investors. All of them were old money dinosaurs, friends of his late grandfather, who were investing based on a family name that no longer meant what it once did. The cash flow was a nightmare. Julian was using new investment money to pay dividends to the older investors, a classic, if amateurish, Ponzi scheme. He was taking exorbitant management fees to fund his lavish lifestyle, the Hamptons wedding, the apartment on Park Avenue, the leased Aston Martin. He wasn't building a business. He was desperately treading water, and the tide was going out. But Marcus had found the crack, the one I was looking for. The largest investor was a man named Arthur Vance, an 80-year-old retired shipping magnate for Boston. Vance had invested $10 million just 6 months ago. The file included a transcript of a recent, terse email exchange. Vance was getting nervous. He was asking pointed questions about the fund's performance, questions Julian was artfully dodging. Vance was the weak point. He was the first domino. Appended to Vance's profile was a single, elegant piece of leverage. Marcus had discovered that Vance's own company, now run by his son, was under a quiet preliminary investigation by the EPA for illegal dumping practices at one of their shipyards in Baltimore. It was nothing concrete yet, just whispers. But whispers were enough. The plan formed in my mind, cold and clear. I wasn't going to go after Julian directly. Not yet. That was clumsy. I was going to make Julian's world crumble around him, forcing him to make mistakes. I sent a one-word reply to Marcus. Proceed. Less than an hour later, things began to move. Marcus used a multi-layered series of cutouts, a law firm in Delaware, which hired a private investigator in Boston, who in turn paid a disgruntled junior staffer at the EPA to leak a single anonymous tip. Not to the press. That was too loud. The tip went to a very specific, ambitious agent at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. The tip was simple. It suggested that a prominent Boston investor, Arthur Vance, might be trying to hide assets from a potential massive EPA fine by sinking them into a speculative, high-risk fund. It mentioned Croft Ventures by name. It was just enough smoke to make a hungry agent go looking for a fire. It was a lie, of course, but it was a plausible lie that connected two seemingly unrelated points. It gave the SEC a reason to start asking questions. 2 days later, on Tuesday, my personal cell phone rang. It was Amy. Her voice was bright, but I could hear a brittle edge to it. "Dad, hi, how are you?" she asked, the forced cheerfulness a clear sign something was wrong. "I'm good, sweetheart. How's married life treating you?" I said, my tone warm and fatherly. I was sanding a piece of maple for a bookshelf I was building, the familiar rasp of the sandpaper a counterpoint to the tension in her voice. "Oh, it's wonderful. We're just settling in," she said. A pause. "Actually, Dad, something a little strange happened. Julian got a letter today from the SEC. They're asking for records about one of his investors." I feigned ignorance. "The SEC? That sounds serious. Is everything okay?" "Julian says it's just a routine inquiry, a fishing expedition. But he's stressed. He's been on the phone all day. He had to cancel our dinner reservations." She was trying to downplay it, for my sake and for hers. She didn't want to admit that the perfect fairy tale already had a crack in it. This was the part one hated, using her, even passively, as a source of information. But it was necessary. I needed to monitor Julian's reactions in real time. "Well, these things happen in business, Amy," I said calmly. "Don't you worry. Julian's a smart man. He'll handle it. You just focus on being a newlywed." "I know. Thanks, Dad. I needed to hear your voice," she said, and my heart twisted. She was reaching out to her rock, the one constant in her life, not knowing I was the earthquake shaking her new foundation. Anytime, sweetheart. You know that, I said. We hung up. I put the phone down and looked at the smooth, sanded piece of maple in my hands. A perfect surface, but underneath, the grain was full of complex patterns, twists, and knots. Just like people. From a distance, Julian looked flawless. But I had a feeling that once you started applying pressure, the whole thing was going to splinter. The first domino had tipped. Arthur Vance, squeezed between the EPA and the SEC, would start demanding his money back. Julian didn't have it. The pressure would build. And desperate men, I knew from long experience, always make the most predictable mistakes. Financial pressure is a solvent. It slowly dissolves a man's confidence, his relationships, his carefully constructed lies. But it can be slow. I needed to accelerate the process. I needed a hammer. The bookshelf I was building for Amy's old room was nearly finished. I ran my hand over the joined corners of the walnut, feeling for imperfections. It was a simple, honest object built to last for generations. Everything Julian Croft was not. While the SEC began its slow, bureaucratic squeeze on his professional life, it was time to apply pressure to his personal one. For that, I needed a different kind of tool than Marcus. I met him in a 24-hour diner off I-95, the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and the lingering smell of stale coffee and bacon grease. It was 3 a.m. on a Wednesday. The place was empty except for a tired-looking waitress and a long-haul trucker nursing a cup of coffee at the counter. Silas was already there, in a booth in the back corner, facing the door. He didn't look like much, and that was his greatest strength. He was in his late 40s, with thinning hair and a nondescript gray windbreaker. He could have been an accountant, a traveling salesman, anyone. But he had the stillness of a predator. He never fidgeted. His hands rested flat on the table on either side of a black coffee mug. His eyes didn't just look at you. They scanned, cataloged, and assessed. Silas had been the best investigator in the Army's Criminal Investigation Division before I'd made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Now, he ran the entire Security and Intelligence Division of my company. He was a man who kept the walls of my empire silent and secure. "Frank," he said in a low voice, a quiet acknowledgement as I slid into the booth opposite him. He didn't smile. I don't think I'd ever seen him smile. "Silas," I nodded. The waitress came over, and I ordered a coffee, black. We didn't speak again until she had poured it and left. "I have a domestic matter," I said, getting straight to the point. "A personal background check. Deep dive. Subject is Julian Croft." Silas's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. He knew who Julian was. He knew about the wedding. He was one of the few people who had access to my personal life, a necessity for the man in charge of protecting it. "What are we looking for?" he asked. "Leverage," I said simply. "Stress points. The kind of secret a man like him can't afford to have exposed. Gambling, debts, women, private grudges. I want a map of his vices. I want to know who hates him enough to talk. Discreet, utterly. I want ghosts. Electronic footprints that vanish, interviews that never officially happened. He can feel the walls closing in, but he should never see the hands pushing them." Silas took a slow sip of his coffee. "It will be done." That was it. No more questions. No discussion of price or resources. He stood, left the 20 on the table, and walked out into the pre-dawn gloom. I stayed and finished my coffee, the bitter taste a perfect match for the business at hand. Exactly 1 week later, a plain manila envelope appeared in my mailbox. Not delivered by the Postal Service. It was just there. Inside, there was no letter, just a slim data stick and a few printed photographs. I spent that evening in my workshop, the plans for the bookshelf pushed aside. The contents of Silas's report were clinical, concise, and utterly devastating. Julian wasn't just a bad investor. He was a degenerate gambler. Silas's team had traced him to a series of high-stakes, illegal poker games in a Manhattan penthouse. He was down over $500,000. The photos showed him at a table, his face pale with sweat, a look of raw desperation in his eyes that was a world away from the confident groom at the wedding. Worse, he didn't owe the money to a casino. He owed it to a private credit facilitator, a loan shark with ties to the Russian mob. The debt was accruing interest at a rate that would cripple a man with 10 times Julian's actual net worth. But it was the last section of the report that made my blood run cold. It detailed Julian's relationship with a young tech founder, a kid named Ben Carter. Julian had acted as his mentor, advising him on a new piece of software, only to steal the core concept and patent it under a shell corporation. He'd gutted the kid's future and left him with nothing but legal bills. The report included a transcript of a conversation, recorded by one of Silas's operatives, with a heartbroken and furious Carter. I wasn't just digging for dirt anymore. I was mapping the geography of man's soul, and it was a barren and toxic landscape. This wasn't just about greed. It was about a deep-seated pathology, a need to dominate and destroy. My encrypted phone buzzed. A text from Silas. Report received? Yes, I typed back. A moment later, he called. The situation is more volatile than the financials suggest. Frank, Silas's voice was flat, but I could hear the underlying warning. He's not just a white-collar scammer trying to stay afloat. He's cornered. He's in debt to dangerous people, and his whole world is starting to unravel because of the SEC inquiry. Cornered animals don't play by the rules. I'm aware, I said, my eyes fixed on one of the photos of Julian. The charming mask was gone. This was the real man. Weak, predatory, and afraid. He's desperate, Silas continued. And desperate men are dangerous, especially to those closest to them. The implication hung in the air between us. He meant Amy. I ended the call and walked over to my workbench, picking up a heavy framing hammer. I felt its weight in my hand, the smooth, worn hickory of the handle, the cold, unforgiving steel of the head. The solvent was working. Now it was time for the hammer. It was time to start making noise. For men like Julian Croft, money is only half the currency. The other half is perception, reputation, the silent, collective agreement among their peers that they belong. It's a fragile ecosystem built on invitations, introductions, and whispered endorsements. And it was time to poison the water. My strategy shifted. Marcus had created the financial pressure. Silas had identified the personal weaknesses. Now I needed to weaponize them in the one arena Julian couldn't control, the court of public opinion among the elite. The tool for this phase wasn't a banker or a spy. It was a woman named Eleanor Vance, no relation to the investor, Arthur. Eleanor was in her late 60s, impeccably dressed, with a wit as sharp as a shard of glass. 20 years ago, her husband's hedge fund had been destroyed by a corporate raider, a man who happened to be Julian Croft's grandfather. The Crofts had built part of their now-fading legacy on the ruins of Eleanor's family. She had a long memory and an even longer reach. She ran one of the city's most influential and feared charity foundations, which was merely a front for her real role as the social arbiter of New York's upper crust. I had quietly become one of her foundation's largest anonymous donors years ago, a chit I had never intended to cash. Until now. I met her for tea at the Carlyle. It was her territory, the hushed tones, the deferential waiters, the sense of insulated power. It was a world I normally avoided, but today I was entering it as a tactical theater. "Frank," she said, her smile warm but her eyes analytical. "It's been too long. I was so surprised when you called. You're usually content to be my silent, generous ghost." "I need a favor, Eleanor," I said, skipping the pleasantries. It was the only language people like her truly respected. "Oh," her eyebrows arched with interest. "This sounds far more exciting than discussing auction items for the fall gala." "I am listening." I didn't give her the whole story. I gave her a piece of it, carefully curated. My daughter recently married into the Croft family. Julian Croft. Eleanor's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "I know the name. Their star has faded, shall we say. But the boy is handsome. He has his grandfather's charm, if not his business acumen. There's a rumor," I began, leaning forward slightly, lowering my voice, "that his venture fund is under SEC scrutiny. Something to do with an investment from Arthur Vance in Boston. There's a suggestion of impropriety, unethical dealings." I let the words hang in the air. Eleanor's eyes gleamed. This was not just gossip. This was gossip with a pedigree, a connection to old names and old money. It was her native language. And I added, delivering the second, more personal blow, I've also heard whispers of some very unsavory gambling debts. The kind of debts that attract the wrong sort of attention. I didn't need to provide proof. I didn't need to show her Silas's photos or Marcus's financial charts. I was a credible source, and I was giving her a story that confirmed what her circle already suspected, that the Crofts were no longer what they seemed. I had given her a weapon, and she would know exactly how to use it. "How unfortunate for your daughter," she said, her voice dripping with insincere sympathy. But her eyes were already distant, calculating the social calculus. One must be so careful these days. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. The effects were immediate and catastrophic for Julian. Eleanor was a master. She didn't spread rumors. She asked concerned questions. At a board meeting for the museum, she might ask, "Has anyone heard how poor Julian Croft is handling that dreadful SEC business?" At a cocktail party, she would whisper to a society columnist, "I do hope those awful rumors about Julian's debts aren't true. His lovely new wife must be so worried." The whispers became a murmur, then a roar in the echo chamber of the elite. Invitations to exclusive dinners suddenly got lost in the mail. Phone calls to potential investors went unreturned. Julian and Amy were publicly snubbed at a gallery opening, the host turning his back with a dismissive coldness that was as brutal as a physical blow. Late that week, Amy called me again. This time, the forced cheerfulness was gone. She sounded small and lost. "Dad, I don't understand what's happening," she said, her voice cracking. "It's like we've become ghosts. People look through us. Julian's business partners are pulling out. We were supposed to go to the Hamptons this weekend with the Vanderbilts, and they just canceled. Their assistant said they had a family matter." I listened, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. This was the necessary collateral damage. I was burning down her dream house to save her from the monster living inside. "He's changed, Dad," she whispered. "He's angry all the time. He's on the phone, yelling at people. Last night, he threw a glass against the wall. He said it was my fault. He said my background was dragging him down." The line went quiet. I heard her take a shaky breath. My knuckles were white where I gripped the phone. He was turning on her, blaming her. The cornered animal was starting to bite. "Amy," I said, my voice steady and calm, a lighthouse in her storm. "Listen to me. This has nothing to do with you. This is about him. Men like Julian, their worlds are built on appearances. When that starts to crumble, they look for someone to blame. Don't you let him make you think this is your fault. Do you understand?" I think so," she sniffled. "Good. You are strong, Amy. You are my daughter. You will get through this," I said, more for myself than for her. I had to believe it. When we hung up, the silence in my workshop felt different. It was no longer a place of quiet focus. It was a command center. The pieces were all in position. Julian was financially crippled, personally exposed, and socially exiled. He was a bomb with a lit fuse, and it was almost time to see the explosion. Silas had been right. He was dangerous, and I realized my endgame had to be faster and more final than I had originally planned. This wasn't a game of chess anymore. It was an extraction. I had to get my daughter out. Now, for 28 days, I had been a ghost. A puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows, content to watch the slow, systematic implosion of Julian Croft's world. But my patience had run its course. The reports from Silas grew more alarming. Julian was becoming erratic. Amy was becoming more withdrawn. The controlled demolition I had initiated was threatening to become an uncontrolled collapse, and my daughter was at the epicenter. I was no longer just waiting for him to break. I was waiting for the final piece of leverage, the one that would give me the right to end this. Absolutely. It arrived on a Thursday evening, just as a cold autumn rain began to fall. The headlights of an unremarkable sedan swept across my workshop window and then vanished. A moment later, Silas was at the door, a dripping umbrella in one hand and a thick, sealed envelope in the other. He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat, his presence sucking the warmth from the room. He didn't speak. He just placed the envelope on my workbench, on top of the blueprints for the finished bookshelf. The contrast was stark. The clean, creative lines of the plans and the grim, final reality of the envelope. "The recording is on the drive inside," he said. "The hard copies are the originals." I nodded. "Is he aware of your surveillance?" "Negative," Silas said. "He's too busy looking for enemies in suits to notice the ones in the shadows. He thinks this is a Wall Street problem." "Good. Get some rest, Silas. You've earned it." He gave a curt nod and was gone as quietly as he'd arrived, melting back into the rain and the dark. I waited until the sound of his car faded completely. My hands felt steady as I picked up the envelope. I slid it open with a utility knife. Inside was a data stick and a sheaf of papers bound by a single clip. I sat down on my workshop stool, the single bare bulb overhead casting long shadows. The papers were a loan agreement. It was from the private credit facilitator Silas had identified, the loan shark. The amount was for $1 million. But it wasn't the sum that made the air freeze in my lungs. It was the section marked collateral. It was a complex legal clause, full of jargon designed to obscure its true meaning. But I'd read enough contracts in my life to see through the smoke. Julian had signed away his future, but it wasn't his future alone. He had leveraged his marriage. He had secured the loan against the anticipated inheritance and financial assets of his wife, Amelia Millercroft, upon the dissolution of the marriage or the death of her father, Frank Miller. He hadn't just married my daughter. He had used her as a bargaining chip in a game with killers. He had placed a lien on her life, a bounty on mine. My blood turned to ice water. The strategic satisfaction I'd felt, the cold anger, it all evaporated, replaced by a pure, primal focus I hadn't felt in decades. This was no longer a lesson. This was an extermination. I inserted the data stick into my ruggedized laptop. There was one audio file. I put on my noise-canceling headphones, not to block out the sound of the workshop, but to hear every single syllable of the betrayal. The recording was from a bug Silas's team had planted in Julian's leased Aston Martin. It was a phone call between Julian and the loan shark's enforcer, a man with a thick Slavic accent. "Enforcer, the clock is ticking, Julian. Our patience is not infinite." "Julian," his voice slick with a desperate, false confidence. "Don't you worry. It's all under control. I got an asset that's better than gold." "Enforcer, this girl? This wife? Her father is just some builder." "Julian," a short, ugly laugh. "That's the beauty of it. He looks like a hick, but he's sitting on a 9-figure fortune. He built one of the biggest private trucking companies in the country from nothing. He just doesn't spend it. The old man adores the girl. She's the key. If he kicks, she gets everything. If she leaves me, I get half. Either way, you get your money. I'm just playing the long game. Enforcer, see that you do. Because if you don't, we will come to collect from the asset directly. It would be a shame to damage such a pretty thing." I closed the laptop. I took off the headphones. The sound of the rain drumming on the workshop roof was deafening in the sudden silence. He hadn't just put her in danger. He had planned it. He saw her, my Amy, as nothing more than a key, a tool to pry open my life's work. I stood up and walked over to the old military footlocker. I didn't open it. I just rested my hand on the cold, dented steel. The ghosts of the past were no longer ghosts. They were allies. The time for subtlety was over. The game of whispers and rumors was finished. It was time to bring him into my world, the real one. I walked back upstairs into the warm, quiet house that Sarah and I had built. I picked up my personal phone and dialed Amy's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice small and tired. "Hi, Dad." "Amy, sweetheart," I said, my voice infused with a warmth and gentleness that felt like a betrayal of the cold fury raging inside me. "I've been thinking. There's been too much distance between us all. Between me and you. Me and Julian. Why don't you both drive out here tomorrow evening? I'll make that pot roast you love. We can sit down, talk everything out, and clear the air. Like a family." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the hope warring with the fear in her silence. "Really, Dad?" she finally whispered. "You'd do that?" "Of course I would," I said. "You're my daughter. It's time to fix this." 7 o'clock. "We'll be there," she said, a hint of her old brightness returning to her voice. "Thank you, Dad. I love you." "I love you too, sweetheart," I said, and hung up. I stood in the silent kitchen, the phone heavy in my hand. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. Tomorrow night, Julian Croft would walk into my house expecting a truce. He would find a reckoning instead. The long night had just begun. I spent the next day preparing. Not just the meal, but the environment. Every detail was a deliberate choice, a piece of the stage I was setting. The aroma of slow-cooked pot roast, carrots, and onions filled the house. The scent of home, of safety, of a happy childhood for Amy. It was a sensory lie, a comforting blanket I was laying over a bed of nails. I set the dining room table for 3. I used the good china, the set Sarah had inherited from her grandmother. Polished silver, linen napkins. In the center of the table, I placed a small vase of fresh-cut freesias from my garden, Amy's favorite. It was a perfect picture of familial reconciliation. At 6 o'clock, I got a text from Marcus. All secondary assets are in position, awaiting your signal. I replied with a single letter, Y. At 6:30, an hour before they were due to arrive, another car pulled silently into my driveway. Silas stepped out, this time wearing a simple dark suit that was well-tailored but forgettable. He wasn't armed, not visibly, but I knew he was carrying. He entered without knocking, his eyes doing a quick, professional sweep of the ground floor. Is the house secure? I asked, basting the roast one last time. Perimeter is established, he said. We have 2 men in the woods, thermal imaging, and a communications jammer. Once they're inside, nothing with a signal gets in or out. No phone calls, no panic buttons. The house is a Faraday cage. You'll have complete privacy. Good, I said, sliding the roasting pan back into the oven. Stay in the study. Don't make your presence known unless I call for you. This first part is between me and him. Silas nodded and disappeared into the shadows of the book-lined study that adjoined the dining room. The door left open just a crack. At exactly 7:05 p.m., headlights swept across the front windows. I watched from the kitchen as Julian's Aston Martin, a car he could no longer afford, crunched to a stop on the gravel. He got out first, smoothing down his expensive suit. He looked terrible. There were dark circles under his eyes, and the confident swagger he'd worn at the wedding was gone, replaced by a tense, hunted energy. He was putting on a brave face, but the man was fraying at the seams. Amy got out of the passenger side. She was wearing a simple dress and looked pale, but when she saw the lights of the house, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She looked at Julian, said something, and he forced a nod, manufacturing a smile of his own. The prodigal son, returning to the fold. I met them at the door, my own expression one of quiet, paternal warmth. Amy, sweetheart, I said, hugging her tightly. Over her shoulder, I met Julian's eyes. He looked wary, suspicious, but also desperate for this to be real. An olive branch from the old man with the money was the lifeline he needed. Hi, Dad, she mumbled into my shoulder. She felt fragile in my arms. Julian, I'm glad you came, I said, extending a hand to him. His handshake was limp, his palm clammy. Frank, thank you for inviting us, he said, his voice a practiced imitation of sincerity. The house smells amazing. Come in. Dinner's almost ready, I said, ushering them inside. We made small talk in a living room for a few minutes. I asked about their apartment. Julian talked about a new business deal he was about to close, a lie so transparent it was almost pitiable. Amy was quiet, watching us both, clinging to the hope that this was real. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Well, I said, clapping my hands together, I think the roast is done. Why don't we sit down? We moved to the dining room. Amy's face lit up when she saw the table. Oh, Dad, the freesias. You remembered. Of course I did, I smiled. I carved the roast, served the plates, and poured the wine. For the first 15 minutes, we ate. We spoke of trivial things, the weather, a movie Amy had seen, the bookshelf I had just finished. I was patient. I let him get comfortable. I let him believe he had the upper hand, that his charm was working, that he was successfully fooling the simple old contractor once again. He started to relax, his posture loosening, a hint of his old arrogance returning. He thought he was being welcomed back. He thought he was winning. When he was halfway through his second glass of wine, I put down my fork and knife, placing them neatly together on my plate. The small metallic sound was sharp in the quiet room. Amy and Julian both looked at me. "Julian," I began, my voice calm and even. "I'm glad we had this chance to talk, because I have a few things I'd like to clear up." He shifted in his chair, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Of course, Frank. Anything. I've been doing some thinking since the wedding," I continued, my eyes locked on his. "About my daughter's future, her security, and yours." A greedy light sparked in his eyes. He thought this was it. The offer. The bailout. "I appreciate your concern, Frank. As you know, the market has been volatile, but—" "I'm not talking about the market," I interrupted, my voice losing its warmth, dropping into a lower, colder register. "I'm talking about your poker games at the St. Regis penthouse." The color drained from Julian's face. He froze, a piece of potato halfway to his mouth. Amy looked from him to me, her expression confused. "Poker games? What poker games?" "The ones where you lost over $500,000 you didn't have," I said, my gaze never leaving Julian's. "Money you owe to Mr. Anton Petrov." Julian's fork clattered onto his plate. I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do," I said. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and pulled out a photograph. One of Silas's. I slid it across the polished wood of the table. It was a crystal-clear shot of Julian at the poker table, his face a mask of desperation. Amy gasped. She looked at the photo, then at her husband, whose face was now a sickly shade of gray. "I'm also talking about a young man named Ben Carter," I went on, my voice like stones dropping into a deep well. "And the software patent you stole from him, registered under a shell corporation based in the Caymans." Julian shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane. You have no right." "Sit down, Julian," I said. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with a lifetime of authority behind it. To my surprise, he hesitated, then slowly, shakily, sat back down. Amy was staring at Julian, her eyes wide with dawning horror. "Julian? Is this true?" He wouldn't look at her. He just stared at me, his face a mixture of fury and raw terror. He was realizing this wasn't an intervention. This was an ambush. "But we're not here to talk about your debts or your business ethics, Julian," I said, leaning forward. "We're here to talk about collateral." And with that, I slid the loan agreement, open to the relevant page, across the table to him. "We're here to talk about my daughter." The dining room fell silent. The only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of Julian Croft. Amy stared at the document, her mind clearly struggling to process the dense legalese, but her eyes kept snagging on her own name, printed in stark black and white. Julian's facade of outrage shattered, replaced by the cornered rat panic I'd been waiting to see. This is a misunderstanding," he stammered, his eyes darting between me and the paper as if trying to find a lie he could grab onto. "It's a standard clause, a formality." "A formality?" I asked, my voice deceptively soft. "Is that what you call leveraging my daughter's life to a loan shark, Julian? A formality?" Amy flinched as if I'd struck her. She looked at Julian, her expression pleading for a denial, for any explanation that would make this nightmare go away. "Julian, what is he talking about? What is this paper?" He couldn't answer her. He just stared at me, naked terror in his eyes. He finally understood that I knew. Not just that he was in trouble, but that I knew everything. The carefully constructed walls of his world had just been reduced to dust. "I was going to pay it back," he finally whispered, his voice hoarse. The deal was about to close. I just needed a little more time. "Time," I repeated, the word tasting like poison. "You ran out of time the moment you put her at risk." I turned my attention to Amy, my voice softening. "Amy, sweetheart, I know this is hard to hear, but you need to listen. You need to understand who you married." I reached into my jacket pocket again. This time, I pulled out a small digital audio recorder. I placed it on the table between the salt and pepper shakers and pressed play. The room filled with the tinny, unmistakable sound of Julian's voice, filtered through the bug in his car. "I've got an asset that's better than gold. The old man adores the girl. She's the key. If he kicks, she gets everything. If she leaves me, I get half. Either way, you get your money. I let it play, every damning word echoing off the good china and the polished wood. Amy sat frozen, her hand covering her mouth, her eyes fixed on the recorder as if it were a venomous snake. Tears streamed down her face, silent and steady. She wasn't just hearing her husband's betrayal. She was hearing the complete and utter death of her love for him, the sound of her entire world breaking. When the recording finished, I pressed stop. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of a tomb. Julian exploded. It was a desperate, pathetic eruption of a man with nothing left to lose. "You!" he shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You did this. You set me up. You and your dirty money. You were never happy for us. You wanted to ruin me from the beginning." He lunged across the table, not at me, but at the recorder, tried to snatch it. He never made it. A shadow detached itself from the doorway of the study. In 2 silent steps, Silas was there. He caught Julian's arm in a grip that was as casual and as unbreakable as a steel manacle. He didn't slam him or throw him. He just stopped him. The force of Julian's lunge died against an immovable object. Julian stared at Silas, his eyes wide with confusion and a new, more immediate fear. He looked at this calm, nondescript man in the dark suit who had appeared from nowhere and was holding him with impossible strength. "Who the hell are you?" he gasped. "He's my head of security," I said calmly. Amy was now openly sobbing, her body shaking with grief and shock. Silas twisted Julian's arm, just enough to force him back into his chair. It wasn't violent, just brutally efficient. Julian collapsed into the seat, cradling his wrist, all the fight gone out of him. He looked from me to Silas and back again, and in his eyes I saw the final, catastrophic realization dawn. The simple contractor, the out-of-place father-in-law. It had all been an act. He hadn't stumbled into a family drama. He had walked into an execution chamber. I looked at my daughter. My heart broke for her, for the pain etched on her beautiful face. But this was a necessary surgery. A cancer had to be cut out. "Amy," I said gently, "look at me." She slowly lifted her head, her eyes red and swollen. "This is not your fault," I said, each word a vow. "You have a good and trusting heart." He prayed on that. "That is his sin, not your weakness. But now you see the truth. And the truth is, this man does not love you. He has never loved you. He loves what you represent. You are a key, an asset, a means to an end." I let my words sink in. I watched her look at the weeping, broken man in the chair opposite her. The man who had been her handsome prince, her future, her entire world just an hour ago. And I saw the last flicker of love in her eyes die, replaced by a cold, clear, and devastating understanding. The illusion was shattered. The fairy tale was over. All that was left was the wreckage, and the choice of what to do with it. I let the silence hang in the room for a full minute, allowing the finality of the situation to settle over Julian like a shroud. He sat slumped in his chair, defeated. The fight was gone, the bluster extinguished. All that remained was a hollowed-out man staring at the ruins of his life. Amy's sobs had subsided into a series of quiet, shuddering breaths. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking at the grain of the wood on the dining table, as if trying to find a pattern in the chaos. "The pot roast is getting cold," I said, the mundane observation a jarring note in the high drama. I stood up and began clearing the plates, scraping the expensive meal into the trash. It was a deliberate act. This chapter of our lives, this disgusting charade, was over and being discarded. Silas remained a silent statue by the door, his presence a constant, quiet pressure. When the table was clear except for the wine glasses and the damning documents, I sat back down. I placed 2 neat stacks of paper in the center of the table. "You have a choice, Julian," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. It was the voice I used for business, for closing deals where the stakes were absolute. He lifted his head slowly. His eyes were dull, lifeless. "On your left," I said, tapping the first stack, "is a full, notarized confession. It details your Ponzi scheme, your theft of intellectual property from Mr. Carter, and your conspiracy to commit fraud using my daughter as collateral. It's been prepared by a team of lawyers who are far better than anyone you could ever afford. My associate, Mr. Silas, will be happy to drive you to the nearest state police barracks to sign it in their presence. From there, the district attorney will take over. Given the evidence we have, you'll be looking at a minimum of 15 to 20 years in a federal penitentiary. I'll let that sink in. I watched him imagine the cold steel bars, the loss of freedom, the utter humiliation. On your right, I continued, tapping the second, slimmer stack of papers, is another option. I slid the second stack across the table to him. This is a series of documents. The first is an irrevocable post-nuptial agreement, ceding any and all claims to any marital assets, now and in the future. The second is the paperwork for an immediate, uncontested divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The third is a legal instrument that transfers the ownership of your shell corporations, including the patent you stole, to a trust fund set up in Ben Carter's name. The fourth assigns power of attorney to my associate, who will liquidate every asset you have left, the car, the apartment, the watches, the art, with all proceeds going to a fund to begin repaying the investors you defrauded, starting with Arthur Vance. You will leave this house with the clothes on your back, your passport, and a one-way, coach-class plane ticket to a destination of my choosing. You will never set foot in North America again. If you do, the confession, I nodded to the first stack, is automatically filed. If you ever try to contact my daughter, or me, or anyone we know, in any way, it will be filed. I lean back in my chair. You will cease to exist here. You will become a ghost. That is your choice. A federal prison cell, or the rest of your life as a nobody somewhere far, far away. You have 5 minutes to decide. Julian stared at the papers, his hands trembling. He was a man drowning, and I had offered him 2 life rafts, one made of steel that would drag him to the bottom, and one that would carry him away to a lonely, desolate shore. There was no third option. He looked at Amy, a last, desperate appeal in his eyes. Amy, please. Amy finally raised her head. The tears were gone. Her eyes were cold and clear, like a winter sky. She looked at the man she had loved, the man she had promised her life to, and she saw him for what he was, a parasite. Sign it, Julian, she said, her voice quiet but as hard as forged steel. There was no love, no pity, just a command. That was the final blow. The last hope he had, that she might somehow save him, was gone. Her judgment was the final nail in his coffin. With a shaking hand, he reached for the second stack of papers and a pen I had placed beside them. He didn't read them. He just started signing, his signature a frantic, sloppy scrawl on each line. He was signing away his name, his marriage, his stolen gains, his entire existence. When he was finished, he pushed the stack back towards me. He looked utterly broken. A ghost already. What now? He whispered. Now, I said, Silas will escort you to your car. You will drive it to a specified long-term parking lot at JFK. You will leave the keys and the ticket in the glove box. You will then proceed to Gate 42. A flight to Bangkok leaves at 4:05 a.m. There will be a man waiting for you at the gate with your passport. Do not deviate from these instructions. Do not try to run. We will be watching you every step of the way. Silas moved from the doorway, took Julian by the arm, and lifted him to his feet. Julian didn't resist. He was a puppet whose strings had been cut. As Silas led him to the door, he looked back at Amy one last time. I did love you, he said, his voice a pathetic whimper. Amy didn't even look at him. She just stared straight ahead, at the wall, at her future, at a life without him. Silas opened the front door, and the sound of the rain filled the house. He guided Julian out into the night. A moment later, I heard the roar of the Aston Martin's engine, a final, impotent snarl before it faded down the driveway and was gone forever. The front door clicked shut. Silas was gone too, and then it was just the two of us, me and my daughter, sitting at the ruins of our dining room table. The sound of the car faded, swallowed by the rain and the night, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any noise. For a long time, neither of us moved. Amy sat perfectly still, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the empty chair where Julian had been. She wasn't crying anymore. She looked hollowed out, as if the storm of emotion had passed through and left nothing behind but a quiet, desolate landscape. I got up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The rain was washing the gravel of the driveway clean, erasing the tire tracks, erasing any sign that he had ever been here. An erasure. That had been my desired end state. I had achieved it. But looking at my daughter's shattered stillness, the victory felt as bitter as ash in my mouth. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own heart, and the primary casualty was her happiness. "He's gone," I said softly, more to break the silence than state the obvious. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Just like that. Just like that, I confirmed. I walked back to the table, gathered the signed documents, and put them into the envelope Silas had left behind. Business concluded. I moved to the sideboard, took out 2 glasses and a bottle of 20-year-old single malt scotch. I poured a generous measure for myself and a much smaller one for her. I placed her glass in front of her. She looked at it, then up at me. "I thought you didn't approve of me drinking scotch," she said, her voice a dry whisper. "Tonight's an exception," I said, taking a seat beside her, not opposite. "Think of it as medicine." She wrapped her cold hands around the glass, but didn't drink. We sat there for another 10 minutes, the silence stretching, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the steady drumming of the rain. Finally, she spoke, her voice so quiet I had to lean in to hear it. "All this time, you knew. At the wedding, you already knew what kind of man he was, didn't you?" I took a slow sip of my scotch, the burn of familiar comfort. I knew he was arrogant. I knew he looked down on me, on our life. I suspected he was weak. I didn't know the depths of it. Not then. But his contempt, it was a warning sign. It was the reason I started looking. She finally looked at me, her eyes searching my face, trying to reconcile the man who had taught her to ride a bike and bait a fishing hook with the man who had just dismantled another human being's life with the precision of a surgeon. "The SEC investigation," she said. "It wasn't a question. The rumors. People turning their backs on us. That was all you." "Yes," I said. There was no point in lying. Not anymore. She shook her head, a look of dazed disbelief on her face. "How? How could you orchestrate all of that? The calls, the whispers, the everything. The man who just appeared from the study." "Dad." Her voice trailed off as the real question finally formed, the one that had been hovering in the air all night. "Who are you?" I looked down at my hands, resting on the table. The same calloused, scarred hands that had built this house, that had held her as a baby. They didn't look like the hands of a kingmaker or a destroyer of men. They looked like the hands of father, a builder. "About 30 years ago," I began, my voice low and steady. "I was just a guy with a single truck and a willingness to work harder than anyone else. I hauled freight. Simple as that. But I started to notice things. Inefficiencies. Vulnerabilities. I learned that the most valuable cargo isn't what's in the truck, but the information about where it's going, when it will arrive, and who is waiting for it. I learned that logistics isn't about moving boxes. It's about controlling the flow of everything." I took another sip of scotch. "So, I started building a different kind of company. Not just trucks on a highway, but a network. A private, secure, invisible network that could move anything for anyone, anywhere in the world with absolute discretion. Corporate clients at first. Then other clients. Governments. Agencies whose names you don't hear on the news. People who needed problems solved quietly." I finally met her gaze. To do that, you can't just have trucks and warehouses. You need information. You need leverage. You need people like Marcus who can navigate the world's financial systems like it's his own backyard. And you need people like Silas who can guarantee the physical security of a shipment or a person against any threat. You build a machine, Amy. A quiet, powerful machine that most of the world never even knows exists. She stared at me, speechless. The simple, hardworking father, the trucking company owner, was a fiction. A carefully maintained cover story for a life lived in the shadows. A life of immense, invisible power. "I never wanted you to be a part of that world," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I rarely allowed myself to show. "I wanted you to have a normal life. A happy one. The one your mother and I always dreamed of for you. All this," I gestured around the warm, comfortable room was meant to be your shield. But I made a mistake. I built the walls so high I didn't teach you how to spot the enemies who would try to climb over them. She finally picked up her glass and took a small, hesitant sip of the scotch, wincing at the bite. So you became a monster to fight a monster. I considered her words. No, sweetheart, I said, shaking my head. The world is full of monsters. They wear expensive suits and have perfect smiles. They're not hiding under the bed. They're sitting across from you at dinner. I'm not one of them. I'm the man who hunts them. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but it was different from the ones before. It wasn't a tear of grief or heartbreak. It was a tear of understanding, of acceptance. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and walked around the table. She came up behind me and wrapped her arms around my neck, resting her cheek on the top of my head, just as she used to do when she was a little girl. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered. I closed my eyes, my hand coming up to rest on hers. The war was over. My daughter was safe. The 31st day was dawning, and for the first time in a long time, our house was clean. The next morning, the world felt new. The rain had scrubbed the air clean, and the rising sun cast long, gentle fingers of light through the trees, making the wet leaves glitter. The house was quiet. I found Amy on the back porch, wrapped in one of Sarah's old patchwork quilts, nursing a mug of coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept, but the frantic terror was gone from her eyes. In its place was a deep, soul-weary calm. She looked up as I stepped out with my own mug and gave me a small, tired smile. "Morning, Dad," she said. "Morning, sweetheart," I replied, sitting in the wicker chair beside her. We watched the steam rise from our coffee, mingling with the cool morning mist. For a while, the only sounds were the birds starting their day and the drip of water from the eaves. "Does it ever get easier?" she asked, her gaze distant, fixed on the woods at the edge of the lawn. Living two lives? Being two different people? I thought about that for a long time. I thought of the deals made in hushed tones in foreign cities, of the cold decisions that protected my people and my assets. And I thought of teaching her to ride her bike on this very lawn, of the smell of pancakes on a Sunday morning, of the life I had so carefully constructed here. "They're not two different lives, Amy," I said finally. "They're two sides of the same job. It's like being a gardener. You spend most of your time nurturing things, helping them grow. You water the soil, you give them sunlight, you protect them from the frost." I took a sip of my coffee. But sometimes you have to pull the weeds. You have to kill the blight before it spreads. You do it without anger, without emotion. You do it because if you don't, the thing you're trying to grow will be choked and die. It's not the pleasant part of the job, but it's the most necessary. She was quiet, processing that. "And I'm the garden? Your mother was the flower," I said, my voice growing thick. "You're the garden she left behind for me to tend. It's the most important job I've ever had." We sat in a comfortable silence again. The sun was higher now, its warmth beginning to chase away the morning chill. "So what happens now?" she asked. "To me, I mean. My whole life, the one I thought I had, it was a lie." "No," I said firmly, turning to look at her. "It wasn't. His life was a lie. Yours was real. Your love for him was real, even if he didn't deserve it. Your hopes were real. That's not something he can take away from you. He just proved he wasn't worthy of being part of it." I reached into the inside pocket of the robe I was wearing and pulled out a single, folded document. It was old, the creases soft from years of being stored. I handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked, unfolding it carefully. It was the original articles of incorporation for the Miller Trucking Company, dated 25 years ago. She scanned the document, her brow furrowing in confusion. "The company, it's in my name," she whispered, her eyes wide. "Amelia Sarah Miller. It's always been in my name. I told you I built a shield," I said. "Miller Trucking is real. It's one of the most profitable, mid-sized freight logistics companies in the Northeast. It's clean. Every book is balanced, every tax paid. It has zero connection to my other business. It's run by a board of trusted managers who have only ever known me as a silent consultant. I built it for you from the very beginning, as a legacy, a fortress, something real and honest and yours, completely separate from the world I have to live in." She stared at the paper, then at me, and a new kind of tears welled in her eyes. Not of pain, but of overwhelming, staggering comprehension. You didn't just protect me, she said, her voice choked with emotion. You built me a kingdom. I built you a foundation. I corrected her gently. What you build on it is up to you. You can let the board run it and live off the income, or you can step in and learn the business. You can sell it. It's yours. It always has been. She folded the paper and held it to her chest. She looked out at the sun-drenched lawn, at the world that was once again full of possibilities. She was hurt. She was scarred, but she was not broken. She was a Miller. She was my daughter. She would heal. I looked down at my hands, resting on the arms of the chair. The builder's hands. The gardener's hands. They had pulled a virulent weed from my daughter's life, and the work had been ugly. But now, the garden was safe. Dad, she said, her voice stronger now. Thank you. Always, sweetheart, I said, looking out at the woods with her. The world is full of wolves like Julian. They will always be there. They sniff around the edges, looking for a way in. I turned and met her clear, steady gaze. I'm not a wolf. I'm the man who builds the walls. And I will always keep them from my door.